Good morning, judges. My name is Emily Tenzar, and my thesis explores the negative impacts in which social media has had on our society as a whole. Before we begin, I'd like to thank each of you for joining me here today and for taking the time to read through my thesis and provide me with questions. So without further ado, let's begin. Social media is more present within our society today than ever before. There's no doubt that these platforms have grown exponentially over the past decade, and such growth will not cease anytime soon. These sites have seen such tremendous successes that they now have the power to influence entire generations. While this influence may have originated as a positive thing, it has since been corrupted and turned into a weapon of mass manipulation. The simple truth is, social media has taken over not just a single generation, but our entire world as a whole. People are no longer able to think for themselves, let alone adopt their own opinions and beliefs, without being influenced by these corrupt platforms. And they will not stop. The sole objective of social media is financial gain, and they seek to obtain it by any means necessary. By just a single click, these platforms are able to manipulate one's privacy, political decisions, and mental health in the most detrimental way possible. The purpose of this thesis is to bring awareness to this pressing issue and inspire change not only amongst these platforms, but within each of us as well. This is no longer an issue that can remain unseen. Social media is a detrimental threat to our society, a threat which can and absolutely must be addressed. Thank you.
Emily, I feel pretty strongly about this subject. I'm really happy that you chose this as your senior thesis. I'm curious, how did you come up with this subject? What drew you to it to make a paper about it?
Yeah, of course. So last year in Challenge 3, we actually did an original advocacy speech where we got to choose a topic of anything that we'd like to research and to discuss. And I chose eating disorders. And a lot of that research that I found had to do with social media and just the media in general and the impacts that it has had on women and men's mental health, especially in teens and the younger generations. And that really inspired me to look further into this issue when I was thinking of what to do for my senior thesis. And we've also done many team policy debates. One of them was on social media, and a lot of the information just in general from all of my high school years has concerned a lot with social media, and that really drew me to this topic in the first place. And I decided to research it further and incorporate all of the ideas that I had already been researching and learning about into one final paper.
It's interesting, half my life I've lived without social media.
Right.
Life was pretty idyllic then, and now social media is very consuming, even as an adult. As I read your paper, I was very much challenged, encouraged, and also convicted. Mm-hmm. What would you tell the younger Mrs. Ashby of 30 years without social media, having a social media? What would you tell that person?
Who has had no past influence from social media? So, before it was even created or anything like that. I would tell her to just be careful and to simply be aware of what exactly is taking place on these platforms, because a lot of the issues that I've talked about in this thesis originate from ignorance and not knowing that it's actually happening to us while we're using them. So simply to make younger you, aware of what's taking place before you use these platforms, because again, my thesis isn't completely taking away social media, right? Because that would simply be impossible. It's so widespread that that's not necessarily an option anymore. So simply bringing awareness to younger you and just being aware of what is going on, and that would probably be the most beneficial at the time. Yeah.
What would you tell the older Mrs. Ashby in terms of bringing awareness to her? I know that let's say I didn't read your paper. Mm-hmm. You're having a conversation with me or having coffee. Mm-hmm. What would you say to me now based on what you've done on your paper?
That's a great question. I would ask you how you feel when using these platforms, and I would assume it would be mostly negative, but maybe it's positive. I don't know. Social media has had positive impacts for a lot of people, but then again, on the other side, it's had very negative impacts. So if you said that you've had a rather positive experience when I've asked you how you feel in the beginning, then I would explain my thesis more to you and explain what could happen in the long term. And if you've said you've had negative impacts on your life, then I would still do the same thing and explain, like, this is why, this is what's taking place, and this is what needs to happen.
Yeah. But I don't know about your arguments.
Right. Right. So I would simply just explain the whole thing. I mean, it depends on how much time we have, because there's a lot.
There's a lot. Coffee cup.
Oh, okay. Then we have plenty of time. I could just go over the whole thing. Yeah.
Last year, someone else talked about cancel culture and social media and the effect. And so this student was arguing that it was very difficult for young people to not use social media because they're basically a social outcast if they don't use it. Mm-hmm. And that's not something I relate to because I did not grow up with it. I was able to have all these years without it, and so now I'm able to moderate it as an adult. But I think for young people, it's literally like they're consumed by it. Their friends are all on it. What would you tell a young person? How could they explain a decision to a young person who says, well, I'm not going to use social media anymore, or I'm going to cut way back, or I'm not going to use these specific platforms, without becoming a social outcast? How could they explain that decision to someone else of their own age group?
So what your question is, how would I explain to like a younger generation, or
a young person who's trying to say, you know what, I see the dangers, I'm not going to use social media. Let's just be extreme.
Okay, so
they're going to tell another friend, I'm not going to use social media.
Got it.
How would they explain that without being a social outcast? How could they still interact with their peers and their friends and not be completely left out of everything that's going on?
Right, that's an excellent question. I think our society nowadays, as I've talked about a lot in my thesis, has intertwined this idea of communication and community in general into social media. So the reality is they need to be separate. Like, while social media can absolutely encourage community and friendships and relationships, I think the younger generation, what they really need to understand is that they can be two completely separate things. You don't need to have Instagram or Facebook in order to be part of a community. There's communities that exist outside of that, and being able to explain that or just exemplify that through not using social media for that particular person, if they're still able to have these relationships and friendships, that just exemplifying that through their own life would be the perfect way to explain it, because it is really hard to explain that to someone. Like, I remember it took me a long time to first download like Instagram, and before I had Instagram, all my friends were like, Emily, like, you should download it, like, we want to like see you and follow you and see all your pictures and stuff. So I absolutely like feel that. So simply just showing that there's a way to live without it would be the most beneficial for anyone, really.
And you think they can do that without being just left out of the conversation?
I absolutely think they can. Like, you can text, FaceTime, there's other things. Like, and again, like Instagram and Facebook, it's not reality. So, I mean, I'm sure you all don't know that already, but just living your own life is like really the best thing I can say, and just showing that it's possible. But again, my thesis isn't really like taking it all away, but if that's what someone chose to do, that would be the best way.
It has something to do with choosing your friends wisely.
Right.
Friends that will interact with you outside of these.
And then you'll have better relationships in the long run. Right.
Nice. Well, I just wanted to give you an overall feedback. This was an extremely well organized presentation. I really appreciated your outline. That was just so very, very nice. Excellent writing, engaging, good vocabulary. I learned a lot. I mean, I'm a little bit familiar with these things, but I learned a lot. It confirmed a lot of my suspicions. And I loved your opener, that dystopian world that was created. It really set me up well for the thesis and for the punch that brought. And I also loved how you connected the opener with your closer.
I like that too.
That was really nice touch there. And I'm not exactly sure if this was the analogy you were trying to paint with that, but we as a society have our eyes closed to how social media is manipulating us and furthering our destruction. However, after reading your paper, my eyes are now open.
Exactly. It's exactly right. It's perfect.
Okay. So I definitely got that. So the history was great. A lot of good information about how it's evolved. And the statistics and the growth was astounding. I was amazed at it's doubled in like 5 years.
I couldn't believe it either. It's crazy. Yeah.
The world is now using social media. I mean, that's incredible. So I just have one little caution about the overall writing, and I'm kind of a writing geek. So it's hard not to say this, but you do use a lot of extreme and absolute terms to describe your points, where it might not be so clear-cut.
Right.
So, for example, in your agreement, let's see, page 5, it says, there is no question that social media platforms are growing exponentially. Such growth will in no way cease anytime soon. Social media is no longer optional, but essentially imperative if you wish to have any connection to society. So I think it might be a little bit, some of those words might be a little bit extreme.
Right.
So there was one other spot. There's no doubt that social media has utterly shattered the mental health of its users, so much so that it's impossible to view it as anything other than an absolute threat to our society. So that's, I think, just being careful about those absolutes, no one, ever, those sorts of things. Sometimes there might be a little room for moderation there.
Right.
But I love the passion behind the statement. So I know that was, I feel the passion as I'm reading it. So I think that's where that's coming from.
Yeah, I could explain if you'd like. Yeah, so I've actually had that come up quite a few times from my mom. And yeah, it has come up. And one of the reasons I chose to keep those absolutes in is because the purpose of my thesis is to bring awareness. Like I said, there's no way to get rid of social media altogether because I've already said this, but it's so widespread. So the only way that I could ensure that my thesis overall had that impact that I wanted it to have, I had to be absolute in order to really push my point across, because in my opinion it was the only way to do it, and it was the only way to bring awareness and to show like this needs to happen, like this is an issue, like we can't remain idle. Like, and going back to page 5, the one about how it's no longer optional but imperative if you wish to have any connection to the outside world. Honestly, in my own opinion, I actually do think this is true. As I've stated already, like communication is intertwined into social media so much that it feels as if it would be impossible to live without it. And like, yes, it is totally possible to not have social media and to have those relationships outside of social media. But as you've already stated, like people would see you as an outcast, and like there's no like getting away from that. And that's why I think it honestly has become imperative. And that it's just the sad truth that I wish it wasn't true, but it is, and that's really the issues that we explore in this thesis.
At least for the younger generations.
Totally, yeah.
Some of the older generations might argue with that.
Of course, yeah, of course.
And then just one more point that kind of goes along with this. You mentioned the algorithms and the minds behind these platforms are absolutely corrupt. However, there comes a point where the government can only do so much to regulate and reform something as pervasive as social media. So just a question to expand on that a little bit, if these minds are all absolutely corrupt. I have several friends, Christian friends, who work for Google and Facebook. And so are you saying that everyone who works at these companies in any creative programming or management capacity, that they are absolutely corrupt? is it possible that some of these minds might have innocent or positive intentions along the lines of, building these platforms? So
Yeah, that's a great question. I agree that they're definitely not all corrupt, but some are. In fact, I don't know if you watched it, but The Social Dilemma is a really great documentary that I got a lot of my evidence from. And a lot that they discuss in there, well, they're all past or current workers for these companies. And it was really interesting because almost every single one of them had left because of the corrupt algorithms that these companies were trying to put out and put on their users. And I thought that was really interesting how they know what's going on and they chose to leave because it was so bad. So I don't think that all of them are corrupt. Absolutely not. That would be a little extreme. But I definitely do think that some are, and that is one of the roots of this ongoing issue.
Okay, so you can juxtapose having Christians still working in that environment and somehow not being a part of furthering this.
Yeah, and I think that's great that they're working for these companies because maybe they could help with the issues that are taking place and see, because if everyone was corrupt, how could we ever make a change? The change starts with us and the people behind the platforms, and having good Christian, good morally right people behind these companies is one of the best things that we can do in order to fix this issue.
I agree a little bit with Mrs. Rangel with regards to absolutes as well. As I read them, the paper was awesome, Emily. Okay, your information was amazing. The things I learned, and what it did cause me to do was ask even more questions. But the peppering of the little bit of the forwardness of ideas or absolutes took me a little bit aback. So I don't, and I understand what you're trying to say with regards to that. I think it's a good way to do it. I think Candace Owens does that, for example, right? She's in your face. But there's also the other side of it where you can approach a situation or a presentation in such a way where it doesn't necessarily, get in the person's face straight up. And be presented in a winsome, persuasive way.
Right.
So I just wanted to let you know that as well, that I felt that too. Now, was it overpowering? No, because I agreed with everything you said. I'm like, yes, Emily, right? Go girl. Right. But then it's like, well, wait, are they all corrupt?
Right, that's an excellent point.
Because, so anyways, that came up for me as well. So my question, because you brought this up too, is if we are living in a world of social media and these platforms, how do we live in it then? How you answered a little bit of it by, giving answers towards your peers, but really, how do we live in it? You can't overlook it. How do we live in it? How would you answer that question? Like, how do we, could you rephrase that? Sorry. We can't get rid of social media, right?
So how do we continue knowing this?
Knowing what we know.
Right.
I mean, here, you made awareness of this.
Right.
Where do we go forward in this?
Right, that's an excellent question.
Do we just, try to cut it off at the knees, or how do we work with it?
Right, that's a great question, and a lot that I try to answer to the best of my ability, because like you said, you can't get rid of it altogether. It's nearly impossible at this point. And one of the main things that each of us can do is limit our time that we're spending on each of these platforms, because that is exactly how they manipulate us and use us. And so ceasing to give them our time is one of the best ways that we can fight back and to continue to live in this world of social media. And simply just changing the way that we use it ourselves. Like I explore a lot in this thesis, a lot of the issues that arise from social media are the people that use it. Not just the people behind the platforms, but us as users and the way that we manipulate the platforms that are set out for us. That is also something that we can change, because the dark side of social media, it has brought out the dark side of people as well. And so again, awareness is key. That's the one thing that we can do once we know that this is happening, to continue to live in this world we have to change altogether the way that we use it, how much time we give it, and again, the people behind the platforms as well.
Mm-hmm. What one change would you recommend?
Time, for sure. Absolutely. A lot that I say in here is that we're essentially the products of social media. When something is free, the product is those who use it. We're the product. So ceasing to give them our time is one of the best ways that we can fight back, and one of the most logical.
Give me an application of that. Make it measurable for me.
What do you mean, like?
Give me a goal to shoot for.
Okay, like for you as a user?
Me as a user, or anyone. What would you say to your friends here?
I would say maybe like an hour a day. If we're putting like a concrete like time on it, like an hour, honestly. Even though I don't spend an hour on it, I'm so guilty of this, but probably like an hour and then just stop. And actually Instagram and I don't know, I don't use Facebook, but they've implemented like time limits that you can put on yourself in order to, limit your use, which further explains or proves that this is an issue since the platforms are trying to fix it themselves by implementing these things in the first place. So I would say that's a good start, an hour, depending on how extreme you think that social media is affecting you.
So can I piggyback on that? In your mental health section, you talk about how social media can be compared to the addictive qualities in drugs. And so we get a dopamine rush when we are using social media and all the likes and approvals and all of that. So cutting back on time is not going to be an easy thing when you're addicted.
Totally.
So I guess just a little more, I'm challenging that thought just a little bit. How can we change people's habits when they're addicted to something? Is it even possible for people to resist if the addiction is as strong as drugs?
Right.
So I went so far as to think, well, maybe we need social media addiction rehab centers like
honestly,
we have for drug users, because how on earth can people really resist people who are deeply into it? And so then there's a Bible verse that came to mind. In Matthew 5:29, Jesus states that if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. Can we even dabble in it at all? Can we do an hour if we're addicted? So I'm just going to challenge you. What are your thoughts as far as that addiction piece and being able to cut back?
Let me add one more piece to that as well, because in our culture, being on social media is not seen as necessarily a negative. It's not like a drug, so to speak.
Right.
It's not seen, and so it's totally accepted, and that's another element that we need to look at as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Honestly, the rehab is kind of a good idea. I didn't even think about that. But I think with anything that you're addicted to, obviously, I think the best solution and the most logical would be to limit it little by little. So this is extreme, but if you're using it like 8 hours a day, maybe take it down to 6 or even 7.5. Like just baby steps would be the key. And again, like if you're addicted, like you have to be aware of the effects of the addiction. So awareness would absolutely help encourage the limitation that is necessary to solve that addiction. So again, just cutting back little by little. I wouldn't go from 8 hours to 1 hour in, like a week or something, but just baby steps, like an hour and half an hour just to help. And again, it has to be personal. Like you have to want to do this for yourself in order to fix the issue. So
you use the word intentional. And so maybe this rehab idea is good.
It's not a bad idea, actually.
So I think as I see it in conversing with you and just thinking about your paper, perhaps, the next step for anybody hearing this would be to begin to create a platform to learn how to help people with their addiction.
So another analogy I kind of thought about was in regards to getting rid of an addiction. It might be like alcohol. If you're not addicted to alcohol, you can have a drink every now and then, right? And you can handle that. But if you are a drunkard or if you are addicted to alcohol, you need to stay away from it completely.
Right.
So I'm going to challenge your assumption that you can just cut back if you've been using it for many hours a day. I'm going to challenge that. I'm not sure people can just have the willpower, self-control to just cut back.
Right, that's an excellent point.
At a point where they need to just eliminate it completely because they are addicted. But as you were saying, people don't recognize this as a terrible thing. And so that's half the battle is recognition. So I wanted to get into the politics a little bit if we have time.
We have 13 minutes.
Okay, that's awesome. So a couple of statements. You say that the U.S. is in the midst of a cold civil war. The more you use social media, the less you understand what the other side believes. And it's scary to think how social media has intensified political polarization and we're now in a cold civil war. And it's scary to think that social media is the main source of misinformation, whether it's from bots or fake accounts. It's very difficult to derive the truth anymore. So how do you think that a classical education has helped you fight this culture to better understand what the other side believes?
That is a very good question. I'm sure my mom's very happy to hear that right now. I would definitely say it's really helped me to think critically for myself. And I see my friends, because I have a lot of friends that go to public school because I swim, so I'm, in that world as well. So I have a lot of friends, and I'm exposed to just how the difference of education. And for myself, I see that I'm really able to think more for myself and to be intentional about what I choose to believe and what I choose to think. And I think that classical conversations in general has really helped me think critically for myself and look at both sides of the story. Because a lot of the times people choose to only believe one side, only see one side. And I see that, and I think it's the most beneficial to look at both sides of the story and really understand the entirety of the argument before choosing to believe a side. And I'm not sugarcoating this because my mom's here or anything. I actually really do believe that classical conversations has significantly helped me with that. And I'm very thankful for the education that it has provided me. So
yeah, and I'll just add, I love how the team policy debate that you guys do.
Oh, I love it.
Years in high school.
Yeah.
Forces you to argue the opposite side of
Totally.
what you might want to be inclined to do.
Totally.
So my daughter's starting to do that this year.
So fun.
And then one more follow-up question to that. You might be aware, Elon Musk purchased Twitter yesterday.
Right. Yeah.
And he's making it a private company. So now he's going to have a lot of control. Part of the statement he issued yesterday is, free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. So that was his Twitter. So do you think there's a healthy role for political discourse on social media platforms? Is there a role for political discourse that allows free speech and maybe doesn't censure your political or social views?
Yeah, absolutely. I think social media is a great place for political discourse, and in fact, it's one of the main forums for political discourse to this day. So I think that having free speech on social media is incredibly powerful, especially when it's not limited by algorithms or the companies themselves who run these platforms. And I think it would be really beneficial for everyone to be able to voice their opinions through social media. And yeah.
So I definitely got the impression that it's extremely difficult to have fair political discourse on social media because of it's so hard to discern the truth.
Exactly.
So, and there's so much fake information and fake accounts. The whole thing about the bots, that was all very eye-opening to me.
Confirmation bias, that was...
Yes.
Right.
Yes, so if you're conservative and you're only looking at those viewpoints, that's what you're going to be fed constantly. So how can you get the other side? How can you get, unless you're actively seeking it out? So,
and yet, I think I would say, can you have political discourse? I suppose you can, but there's nothing like sitting down in front of somebody else and really hashing it out, because then you can see their social cues, their face, their body language. I think there's a lot of, even if Elon opens this up, I still think that there's going to be a lot of miscommunication, because you really
For
can't
sure.
get into a person's life or head, and and it still keeps it impersonal. That's the thing, right? So
Absolutely.
When you were talking about, in your refutation, you were talking about how a lot of people say it encourages community. And you state, it is undeniably true that the original objective of these platforms was to promote community and connections. So I was just curious, how were social media companies planning to make money if their motives were entirely altruistic? So if they had no plans to track data, users' moves, no advertising, if they were really altruistic, how are they going to make money?
That's actually a really good question. Well, I would assume, I wasn't on social media when it originally was created, but I would assume they still had like advertisements and things like that. I don't know, maybe they didn't realize how widespread it would become when they first created it, because again, as I explained in the history, a lot of the past social media platforms that were created they weren't successful. They were at first, but then they plummeted. And so maybe they were going at now that these huge companies were going into it not realizing how huge it was going to become, and so they didn't realize the financial gain that they could have had from these companies, so they didn't necessarily, I don't know, I can't speak on behalf of these platforms, but that's probably like the best answer I could give you to that. Yeah.
Well, maybe they didn't know how to monetize
Right.
their users at
Right.
that point. And that brings me to another question about monetization. So I'm not sure if you researched this, but what are the specific actions that users do that align with companies' monetization goals? So what are the specific things users do that end up monetizing?
Yeah, that's a good question. It really is based on like who they follow, like, because you can follow like brands, celebrities on Instagram, and then that is in turn what sort of ads show up on your feed, what you tend to like more or interact with more. That's how they literally like have algorithms to track that and to figure out what you will engage with. And so that's how they monetize our actions, by looking into literally everything that we do in order to gain financially.
Okay. So that behavioral advertising
Right.
piece. Okay.
I just have one more question about your reputations. In your thesis, it sounded, and you felt fairly strongly about it. But what if some of those reputations aren't bad? And let me give you an example. Let's say a person needs to lose weight, and they get into a group on Facebook, and that group, actually, that community is there for support. Maybe they're an introverted person and they don't get out much, I don't know, whatever. But they're in that group, and in the course of 6 months, they've lost the ideal amount of weight that they want. So that community has served that person well. But it sounded a little bit like, well, this is the only community that you should have. Did I say that right? Anyways. So I'm not saying that what you're saying is not true, because I do agree with all your refutations. However, but there are some elements of it that, why can't I be in this community,
Right.
for example?
Right. Yeah, I totally agree that social media can have absolutely positive effects on people, and that the communities that it creates can absolutely be beneficial and really helpful in the long run. Like if someone were trying to lose weight, I think it would really help. I think, which refutation was that? It was a third.
The community.
Oh, community, right.
Yeah.
I think just in the end, the issues, the negative sides of social media outweigh the positive sides. So while that community may be super helpful for that particular person, in the end, it's not a good long-term solution. I don't think anything with social media as a center is good long-term. I think people really need to prioritize that in-person connection with people, because there's only so far that you can go online. And sometimes you don't realize that when you're so sucked into it.
Very good point. Thank you.
So did you explore or think a little bit about how does the gospel fit into all of this. So in order to break an addiction, some might say the only way is through Jesus, through the power of our faith, to truly change people's behaviors and break addictions. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I actually didn't necessarily look into the Bible for any evidence, because I don't like to use the Bible too much, because then people have to refute it if they have, we're told in debate not to use the gospel, because you don't want to have to refute the Bible, which of course no one would want to do that. But I think that's a really excellent point. I think it would have really good points to incorporate into something like this. And I kind of touched on it with the mental health aspect, just how we're all created to be unique. We're all created in God's image, and we shouldn't let some platform tell us what we should be or how we should look or act. So I kind of touched on it, but I do see what you're saying.
I thought of that point as well. He places great value on his adopted children, and we find our worth in him. We don't need the affirmation from social media. So which of your three arguments are you most concerned about?
Am I most passionate or concerned, or both?
Either one.
Okay.
Yeah, privacy, politics.
Definitely mental health. That's what originally inspired this whole thesis. And I was actually only going to focus on mental health for the whole thing and not talk about privacy or politics. But then I realized it's a long paper. There's only so much you can say, and I really wanted to make sure that I touched on topics that I was passionate about, all three of them. So, but in all, mental health for sure, because again, that's what originally inspired this. And with the eating disorders advocacy speech, that's what really sparked my interest in this topic.
So do you have any personal experience with struggling with social media use, or friends that you've witnessed
Absolutely.
being addicted?
Yeah, absolutely. I had TikTok for a little bit, and I had to delete it. I always re-download it because I'm oh, I'm bored, and I have to delete it because I literally get addicted. I'm so sucked into it. I'm Emily, you need to take a step back. You need to stop. Again, really being intentional about what I'm doing and how I'm spending my time is what I noticed. I really need to improve myself. And even with Instagram, I notice myself comparing myself to the people that I see and influencers, and I'm this isn't real. It's not right. And I don't need to be subjected to this sort of culture. And so I really just try and take a step back and be more intentional about where I spend my time. And yeah, there's no doubt I've definitely struggled a lot with this, and I'm sure most of my friends have as well, which is the sad truth. Yeah.
And not just your age, but people that are older.
Totally. Even my older sister, she's I don't know, 24 now. 25? 25. She's 25. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Emily, you did a fantastic job. I'm so thrilled that this is a subject you looked at and are taking seriously, and I just hope to hear maybe news in the future of what you're going to do with this, because it can make a difference, and the idea of awareness is the first step. So great job.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate your time. This was really helpful.
I'd love to get this into the hands of a lot more people. So
yeah, thank you guys, really.